Okay, good evening. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be learning Maseches Chullin Daf Tzadi, and we're starting about 12 lines or so from the bottom on Pei Testament Beis. We just started a new parak, the parak of Gid Anosha, and what we began with last night was the weird inclusion of our Mishnah that the Isser of Gid Anosha applies both by Mukdashin and by Chullin. The Gemara was bothered by the fact that it included the case of Mukdashin. And if you want to look two-thirds of the way down, the Gemara had answered, don't worry, we're talking about Vlados Kachim Askinan. We're talking about the Vlados Kachim, and then we were talking about the Shlil, about we were talking about the fetus, and that there was Kachim B'mei Iman, and basically, in short, that both Isurim of eating Kachim, which is Asur Behana, and Giranasha, that they aligned at the same time. This is right where we pick up, right here. So says the Gemara, "Umi matzes mukmas la b'shlil." How can you say that we're talking about the case of a fetus? After all, v'amitikatani seifa noig b'shlil. Mukdashin was in the Resha. If you look at the Mishnah, the third line of our Mishnah at the top of the page, it says b'chulin uvim mukdashin. Only in a later case do we talk about the shlil. So if the later case is talking about the shlil, michlal dereisha la b'shlil askinan. Don't tell me the case of Mukdashin is talking about a shlil. That's a separate line in the Mishnah, 2, 3, 4 lines later in the Mishnah at the top of the page. So Mukdashin cannot be talking about shlil. Says the Gemara, yeah. You're right that they're not exactly the same line. However, what you do need to recognize is is to say that this whole idea about the shlil is a machlokas, and it's just being foreshadowed. In the case of Mukdashin, a little bit of a difficult shver answer. We're not going to get into the lumdas behind it, but that's what the Gemara says. Can you tell me that the Isser of Gid Hanasha and the Isser of Hana of eating hektish, those are the same thing? That can't be. After all, we have a brisa later on in this Masechta, Mishnah, I should say, V'hatnan. We have a Mishnah that says as follows: Al elu tumos hanazir megaleach. A nazir, who we know is restricted from becoming tamei, if he does become tummy with the following cases of tumah, he needs to go through a whole tara process, including shaving his head, shaving his body. Well, look at these two cases and how duplicative they are. Al hames, if a person dies, and the nazir gets exposed to that, ve'al kazayis min hames. That makes absolutely no sense. Asks the Gemara, v'kashalan, al kazayis min hames megaleach. If you're telling me that the nazir has to go through this tara process and shave his hair on a kazayas, al kulo lo kol shekain, then on a whole mace, isn't it pashut that if a nazir was exposed to a whole mace, what kind of two cases is that? That doesn't even make any sense. So says the Gemara, you're right. We're talking about a nefel. We're talking about a nazir who was exposed to a nefel, to a newborn who passed away, a stillborn. Shelo nikshru evar begidin, whose body wasn't all connected like it should be. Rashi lenefel shekulo kayam. V'adayin lo niskashru evar begidin. Shari kol evar of notzrin v'adayin enelo kazayis basar. The way it was structured was it was a mace, which was what the Mishnah on Daf Kufim Beis, the one that we just referred to here, says al hameis vel kazayis min hameis. When it says al hameis, it's talking about a nefel that doesn't even have a kazayis of basar. So that's the case. Alma, turning to the top of Tzadi Amud Aleph, Alma iser mukdashin kadim. We see that the status and therefore the iser of hektish comes first. Was the animal hektish before it had a kazayis of basar? Absolutely, it was. So you wanted to say earlier that perhaps the two Isurim of Gid Anoshe and the Hana of Hektish, they're coming hand to glove at the same time, punk at the same time, boom, both Isurim kick in. No. Hektish comes first, but the Gidin, the Gidin were not in place yet. That's what Rashi here points out at the top of the page. Take a look at Rashi, Dibra Maschel, top of Tzadi Amud Aleph, Alma Isser Mukdashin Kadim. Rashi says, the Mishasha Notzar Hu Kadosh. Out of the gates, once there's a heartbeat, again, I'm applying that approximately, once the fetus is considered a fetus, then it has the status of Kadosh, but V'adayin lo notzar hagid, but still the sciatic nerve isn't in place. The lo chazinon the yitziras ubar kodemes litziras gid. The ha chazinon, because we see that hektish applies first. So how can you suggest at the bottom of Pei Testament Beis, this was the answer we saw as to why Mukdashin was referenced in our Mishnah, because the Isser of Gid Anosh and the Isser of Mukdashin are Bahade Adade Ka'asu, says the Gemara Nishpashut. It's not so true that that's the case. So the Gemara says, Afal gav de Isser Mukdashin Kadim, even though you're right that the Isser of Hektish does come first, Asi Isser Gid Chayil Alaihu. Don't worry, we are able to have the Isser of Gid Anasha start later. You're right, they don't both happen at the same time, but they do both happen. Hektish first, Gid Anasha later. Rashi, third line, Dibra Maschel Isser, Afal gav de Isser Mukdashin Kadim. Asi Isser Gid V'chayil. Rashi says, Hol ve'isr chamorhu, as we'll soon see, shekein noheg b'bnei Noach. Therefore, we say that that's what our Mishnah is talking about. Let's look in our Gemara, that afal gav de isr mukdashin kadim, even though the animal becomes hektish first, asi isr gid chayil alayhu, that even though the isr of gid anosha starts later, it still applies. Why? Shekein isuro noheg b'bnei Noach, because the Isser of Gid Anoshe applies even to Bnei Noach. Unbelievable. If we talk about the Sheva Mitzvos, Bnei Noach, it's Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Gimel, Dalet, Hevav. It's Ever Minacha, it's Birkos Hashem, which is cursing Hashem, Rachmana Litzlan, it's Gezel, it's Gilui Arayos, it's Din, it's Hereg, and Avodah Zarah. The Gemara accepts it fait accompli that that's definitely the case. It's just because it's very chamor din by b'nei Noach. So that, if you look at the Mar Makomos, we're going to learn about this in about 10 days. Fine. So says the Gemara, Man shamas le hai svara. Who's the one who holds, and Rashi fills in the gaps here, that b'nei Noach have an isser of gid hanoshe? So says the Gemara, I'll tell you who it is. It's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda from our Mishnah. Go look at our Mishnah on the Unpaid Testament base. You'll see that Rabbi Yehuda is 5 lines into the parak. Says the Gemara, that's all fine and good, but Rabbi Yehuda is not the Tanakama. What was the question we were trying to answer? Why did you have to tell me about Mukdashin? Well, who wrote that? That wasn't Rabbi Yehuda. That was the Tanakama. So the Gemara says, that's great that it's Rabbi Yehuda, but Hamas Nisan, Deloka Rabbi Yehuda. The Reisha of our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Diktani, what did our Mishnah say? Noeg bebehemu uvachai b'yerach shel yiminu v'yerach shel small. That's not the language of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds not that way. And you can look in the Mishnah and see that that's the case. So I don't understand what you're saying. If you want to tell me that the case of Mukdashin, that we allow for staggered Isurim, that first the Isur of Hektish kicks in, and only later do we have the Isur of Bnei Noach because the Isur of Gid Anasha because it was a Din Chamor by Bnei Noach. That's all fine and good according to the Tanakama. That works. But it doesn't work according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Yehuda, if you're saying he's the author of the Ben Noach, that's fine. That's great. No problem. But that's not the Reish of our Mishnah. So it says the Gemara Tzad Yom Aleph 6-7 lines down. Haitana savar la kavase bechado palagale bechada. The author of our Mishnah agrees to Rabbi Yehuda in one area, but disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda in another area. Rashi fills in the gaps. What does that mean? It's savar le kavase bechada, 12 lines down in Rashi's denoig b'bnei Noach upalagale bechada denoig b'shtei rechos. That according to the Tanakama, he holds that the Gid Anasha applies to both. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it only applies in one. So that's how we can understand our Mishnah. Eimar Deshama Aslay, says the Gemara. Perhaps I could understand the Rabbi Yehuda when we talk about an animal that's betmeya to Isser Lab. But perhaps when we talk about Kachim to Isser Kares, Misham Aslay, would he really say that when it comes to an Isser Kares, that would be the case by Kachim, that we would include that case? Maybe we should only be talking about a case of Isser Lab. So let's take a look at Rashi again. So many important Rashis here. Eimar Deshama Aslay, the Rabbi Yehuda, De Amar De Mishum Chumre De Gid. You want to say that because Ben Noach is a unique Isser in regards to Gid Anosha, all is fine and good, but don't add it on top of Kachim. Maybe add it on top of a lower level Isser, just an animal that's tummy. So the Gemara therefore pivots and scraps this whole answer and says as follows: what are we talking about? A female cow that's about to deliver a bechor. That's the verb of hamivakeres, that she is about to give birth to a bechor. When does this animal become holy? The berechem kadosh. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says, that perhaps that's the case we're talking about. By saying avlados kajim be'avyasan hein kdoshim, that really animals that are kachim, when does the animal become kachim? Not berechem, but rather be'avyasan, once they come into existence, once they are born, and therefore the two isurim do come together like we started. Omar Reb Chia Bar Yosef. Reb Chia Bar Yosef says, Lo shanu, we did not learn this halacha, that the shiur, that the isser of Gid Hanosha is the case, ala kachim hane'echalim. that only applies, perhaps the Isser of Gid Anashe only exists by animals that are kachim that are edible. Let's say kachim kalim, right? Korban Pesach. But aval kachim she'enon ne'echalin. But if you have a case of kachim and it's an animal that you're not allowed to eat, like an ola, let's say, perhaps ein iser gid anasha gid noeg b'hem. The whole thing is odd because when we think about a chefza shel iser, you talk about a chazer. A chazer is aser no matter what the context is. Gid anasha. We would have thought that gid anasha is aser no matter what the context is. Gid anasha. It's just a part of the body that's not kosher. By behema, there's chelev. You're not allowed to eat this part of it. Gid anasha is subject to the status of the animal. So that's what Reb Chia Bar Yosef wants to say, is that when it comes to kachim she'enan ne'echalin, then there is no isser of gid anasha. That means if I eat a korban ola, which I should not do, and it's aser ba'anah for me, but at least I won't violate the isser of gid anasha. However, Rabbi Yochanan Amar echad kachim ne'echalin, ve'echad kachim she'enan ne'echalin. Isser gid noig bahen. Stop making, you're splitting hairs. The answer is that you're going to be chayiv one way or the other. Gid anasha is not subject to the edibility of the kachim. Whereas Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef wanted to say that kachim ne'echalim have a din of gid anasha, and kachim she'enan ne'echalim don't have a din of gid anasha. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no distinction to be made. And we're going to have three approaches about these two things. Are they arguing or are they not arguing? Amar of Papa, 1/3 of the way down, velo pligi kan lehalkoso, kan leha'aloso. One's talking about malkos. That's the first shita. And one is talking about leha'aloso, about whether or not you bring it up on the mizbech. Ika de amri amar papa velo pligi kan lechalso, kan leha'aloso. One's talking about being choletzit, which is kind of taking out the gid, and the other is talking about bringing it up on the korban. So these are two approaches about how they're not arguing. And over the next half an amud, a little bit more, we're going to be discussing the shita that perhaps they are arguing. And what would they be arguing on? Halfway down, the Gemara says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kamar l'ha'aloso pligi. Really, they are arguing about whether or not it is viable to be brought on the Mizbeach itself. Why? The Tanya. We have a brisa. The brisa says, a brisa from Maseches Zvachim, V'ktira kohen es hakol ha-mizbecha. The kohen should be maktir everything on the Mizbeach. Drasha. L'rabos ha'atzamos v'hagidin v'hakarnayin v'hatzlafim, the inedible parts. This is talking about the bones, the skeleton. V'hagidin, sinews, which are very hard and are inedible. V'hakarnayin are the horns, of course, inedible. V'hatzlafayim, which are the hooves, which are inedible. So says the Gemara that when you take an animal, you don't have to remove those parts. You just take the animal and you put it on top of the mizbeach. Maybe we would assume that you have to put these inedible parts of the animal, yatzamos, gidin, karnaim, and slafim on the mizbeach, even if they were separated. So let's say I cut off the hooves and whatever the case may be, I removed all the bones, I removed the horns. If they were separated, maybe do I still have to put them on? Talmud Omar, no. They don't have to be put on. V'asisa olosecha, only habasar v'hadam, only the flesh components. Ibasar v'hadam yachol yachlot gidin v'atzamos v'yala basar legabe mizbeach. If you want to say we should bring the basar and dam, maybe we should be me'aker, we should do chalitza on the gidin and on the bones and just put up the basar itself. Everything goes up. So how do we live in both worlds? On the one hand, the pasuk says basar v'dam. At the same time, you said you should add the bones in some circumstances, and you shouldn't add the bones in other circumstances. So the Gemara threads the needle 2/3 of the way down. Haketzad mechubarin ya'alu. When these inedible parts of the body are there, again, the bones, the sinews, what were the other two? The horns and the hooves. When those things are attached to the body, yalu, of course, they should be brought up. That's what the pasuk means. But Pershu, if you separated them from the animal, then afilu b'rosh shel mizbeach, even if you separated them while you're already up on the mizbeach, and it's a shtickle chutzpah to be up there and take down something that was up there, but nevertheless, yerdu, you should take it away. Uman tana deshamas leidamar pirshu yerdu. Who is the shita that says that if you separated one of these inedible parts of the animal, that they need to be taken down? Again, the bones and the sinews and the horns and the hooves. Who is that? That's Rebbe. Now let's analyze a little bit deeper, because what we're trying to do right now is to show that there's a machlokes about the ha'aloso between what we saw earlier in the Gemara, between Rav Chia bar Yosef, who made a distinction between kachim and echalim and kachim she'ein echalim, and Rav Yochanan, who did not. So says the Gemara, 12 lines or so from the bottom, maybe a drop more. Rebbe, the Tanya, Viktir HaKohen es HaKol. What does that come to teach us? So says the Gemara, what that comes to teach us is lerabos ha'atzamos v'agidin v'akarnaim v'atzlafim v'afidu pirshu. This is not our shita. That's the Tanna Kama. We're going to get to Rebbe soon. But what do we see from here? That these parts of the animal that are not edible, that they are included, they are ola, they are burned, even if they were separated. So let's say, just easy example, I cut off the hooves. So according to the Tanna Kama, you still put it on the mizbeach. If that's true, v'hamani mekayim v'asisa olosecha basar v'adam. According to the Tanna Kama, who throws in inanimate objects and has no limit, meaning even if you separate the hooves, you still have to throw them on. What does he do with the pasuk that says it's only about the basar and about the dam? It says the Gemara, that's only talking about bipoken. What's bipoken? So the Meforshim here explain that bipoken is when something pops off the fire because of the heat. That's what Rashi says. 3 lines from the bottom, down to 2 lines from the bottom, me'al ha'or. It splatters off. Let's say you have a piece of meat there, and there's an ember, a piece of wood, and it just kind of pops. We've all seen this before. If you've ever been to a bonfire, the meat falls off the pyre. So the halacha is that needs to be put back. Haketzad ikule basar atamachzir. If there's flesh that's only partially cooked and it falls off, you need to return it. V'i atamachzir ikule gidin v'atzamo. So this is how the Tanna Kama splits and lives in both worlds. On the one hand, he says that even if you remove these inedible parts, they have to be put back on. So what do you do with the pasuk of it's talking about if pieces of the animal fall off the fire, the edible parts get put back, the inedible parts. So all that's the Tanna Kama, not the shita that we need. But Rebbe Omer, this is the shita we do need. Kasu vechad Omer b'ktira kohen es hakol. One pasuk says that the kohen shechs everything. Says the Gemara, riba. That's an inclusionary term. The next pasuk says that you should only put up the flesh and the blood, and says the Gemara, miyet. So how does he deal with the tension in the psukim? Because really, what the Tanna Kama and Rebbe are dealing with is this tension. On the one hand, it says viktir hakol, and at the same time, it says only basar v'dam. The Tanna Kama gave his answer. We already learned it. So what does Rebbe say? Haketzad nechubarin yalu. That if everything is all connected, the hooves are still connected, the bones are still connected, the horns and everything, the sinews are all connected. Okay, Sender Gamor. So Haketzad mechubarin yalu. If they're all connected, you don't remove them from the animal, you put them up. That's what hakol means. However, perishu. But if they've already been separated from the animal, afilu b'rosho shal mizbeach, even if it was on top of the mizbeach, yerdu. What do we see from here? We see that there's a machlokes tanaim about what goes up on the mizbeach, and therefore, perhaps that is the machlokes of Rav Chia bar Abba and Rav Yochanan that we learned 1/3 of the way down. Ay v'Rabbanan, how do you learn the psukim? I don't understand. Didn't you see Rebbe? Why don't you follow Rebbe's rule that if they're mechubarin, that they are put on the mizbeach? If they're parachute, then they're not. So the Rabbanan say, because I don't agree with Rebbe fundamentally. Why don't I agree with him? Because 3 lines from the bottom of Rabbanan, mechubarin, lo etzrich krale ribuye. That's so obvious. I don't need to dissect the animal to only have flesh. I could just put the whole animal up. That's Svaradik. I don't need a pasuk for that. Midi dehave arosha shalola. No different than the head of the animal. Rashi, midi dehave arosha shalola detzarch shiakrivenu shalem. V'es harosh v'harei atzamos harbe yesh. What do we see? Rashi points out for about the rosh. It's mostly bone, but the head has to be there. So says the Rabbanon pushing back on Rebbe, what do you mean you need a drasha to tell me that if it's mechubar and yalu? A pashut that if it's mechubar and yalu, because the head has to be brought. You're not allowed to not be makar of the rosh. And if the head has to be brought, it's mostly made out of bone. So then I don't need your pasuk to tell me about mechubar. I have a Rebbe, mechubarin dehetera, turning to the top of Tzadi Amid Beis, lo isrich krala ribuya. You're right. When it comes to that which is mutter, I agree with you. Ki isrich kra Legid hanoshe b'mechubar. Now we're getting connected back to our sugya. Says the Gemara, you're right. The Rebbe looks back at the Chachamim and says, I agree with you. You're right that there's a svara, that if something's mechubar and that it's yellow, that's not why we needed the pasuk. Pasuk, ki itzrich kra was legid hanoshe b'mechubar. That's mamash a shel iser. So who does it get included? Does it not? Rebbe says it's included. The Chachamim presumably would say not. V'Rabbanan mimashke Yisrael min hamuter leYisrael. Of course it does. The Gid Anasha can't be put up on the mizbech. Only that which is mutter to a Yisrael can be put up there. The Yid's not allowed to eat the Gid Anasha, so fine. So it's not allowed to be brought up there. So now we see this machlokas. The Rebbe, what do you do with the drasha mimashke Yisrael? According to the Rabbanan, you're not allowed to put up the Gid Anoshe because it's not mutter for a Yid. So Rebbe, what do you do with that? Rebbe, mi did have a chelev adam. Is chelev mutter? Is blood mutter? What do? You're gonna drain the whole cow of all of its blood before you put it out? It's just not what we do. We put things that are usher for people to eat all the time. The Gid Anoshe is no different, and therefore they disagree. Rabbanon, good push on the Rabbanon. According to the Rabbanon, if you hold that the drush of Mimashke Yisrael is minamoter Yisrael, Rebbe's got a great point that the chalev has to be burned and the blood has to be burned. So the Gemara, what did the Rabbanon say? Rabbanon mitzvasan bekach, and therefore shiny. You can't compare the chalev and the dam. The chalev and the dam need to be burnt. That's part of the mitzvah of the korban, and therefore you can't compare. So this is the concluding machlokas that we have between the Rabbanon and Rebbe, that according to the Rabbanon, the Gid Anoshe is not allowed to be put on the mizbeach. It has to be removed. According to Rebbe, it is. And that is what Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak had said, that really when we look at the machlokas between Rav Chia Bar Yosef, was that his name? Yeah, Rav Chia Bar Yosef and Rav Yochanan. Perhaps this is what they were arguing about, is this din of whether or not the Gid Anoshe is allowed to be put on the mizbeach. We're on the top of Tzadi Amud Beis, heading down onto the two dots, about 12 lines or so from the bottom of the page. Then Amir Hashem, tomorrow we'll learn as much as we can. A couple of long blot ahead of us. So it says the Gemara as follows. We are 5 lines down, 4 lines down. Amar Rav Huna, Gid Anoshe shel Ola. Rav Huna says that the Gid Anoshe of the Ola, Cholto, you take it out, and L'tapuach, you put it on the mound of ashes that are in the middle of the, in a particular area on top of the mizbeach. There's a place where all the extras went to burn. Amar Chizda Mari Dichi, is this really true what you're saying? After all, Miksiv, does it say Al Kain Lo Yochal HaMizbeach? What's the prohibition of the Gid Anoshe to go on the fire? Who cares? Why does it have to be moved over to the tapuach? After all, what does the pasuk say? Al Kain Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael Ksiv. It's nothing. Why can't you put it on the mizbeach? Why do you have to remove it and put it on the tapuach on top of all the ashes? There's no restriction for the mizbeach to have the Gid Anoshe, only for a yid. Rav Huna, says the Gemara, Mimashke Yisrael min hamuter Yisrael, similar drasha as before, that he holds like the Rabbanon that we saw earlier, clearly aligned, because he said you have to remove it. That's obviously not a Rebbe Jew. That's obviously a Tanakama Jew. That's obviously what we saw earlier. So Rav Huna mimashke Yisrael min hamuter Yisrael, and therefore the Gid Anoshe has to be removed. I ask the Gemara Meisvei, Gid Anoshe shel Shlamim mechabdo la'ama, that if you have a Gid Anoshe of a Shlamim, you're allowed to sweep it, or basically throw it into the Amma, which was a water aqueduct that ran under the floor of the Beis HaMikdash with little entrances where you could put stuff in there, and they would put the Gid Anoshe there. However, V'shel Ola Ma'alehu, of the Ola, they would put it up on the Mizbech, Kasha and Rav Huna, because Rav Huna holds that you're not allowed to put that on there because it's not mutter for a Yisrael. Mimashke Yisrael v'lo, which is only something that's mutter for a Yisrael. But here we see that by the Ola, we're ma'alehu. My love, ma'alehu maktiro. Doesn't that mean that we're putting it up on the Mizbech, and therefore, Kasha and Rav Huna, says the Gemara, lo, ma'alehu v'cholza. You do bring it up, but you're choletz. You remove the Gid Anoshe, throw it on the tapuach, and then the rest of the animal you put up. Question is answered. Me'achar shecholzo. He says the Gemara, wait 1 second. If, in fact, you're going to bring the whole korban up there, and once you bring it up there, you're going to be cholzo, you're going to be ma'aker, you're going to do nikra gid v'achelev. Lama ma'alehu. Why then did you bring the whole thing up anyways? Just take out the Gid Anosha before you go up. Says the Gemara, that we have certain standards around how we bring a korban. And what the Gemara is concerned about over here is that you need to bring up a korban as it should be. But when it comes to the Gid Anosha, this is a rhetorical question. Are you really going to bring this piece? You can bring the Ola, but it's not coveted to bring the Gid Anosha. And Tanya Kavase de Rav Huna, the Gemara agrees to the din of Rav Huna. Let's review Rav Huna from 5 lines down. What did Rav Huna say? The Gid Anosha of the Ola you put on the tapuach. So it says the Gemara, Gid Anosha shel shlamim mechabdul amma v'shel Ola cholto le tapuach. Exactly like Rav Huna said, and a brisa to boot. So good to go. Says the Gemara, it's not Hasam. We have a Mishnah from Maseches Tamid, which we learned about 7 years ago. There was a large mound of ash in the middle of the Mizbeach. Pa'amim, sometimes, haya alav kishlosh meos kur. It had an incredibly massive amount of ash that was 300 kur, which is, I don't know how to describe it. I don't know what the cubic feet are, but it's a lot. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava Guzma. This is an exaggeration. It just means to say that it's a lot. There were 1,000 people at the bar mitzvah today, right? Just the way we talk. So it happens to be the Gemara often uses 300 as an example of large. It's just an interesting thing to note. But let's continue. Hishku es hatamid b'koshel zav. We learned elsewhere in Shas a while ago that they used to feed water to the korban hatamid because it was easier to be mafshet the skin when they were well hydrated. So what does the Gemara say from Tamid, from the Gemara in Maseches Tamid? Hishku es hatamid b'koshel zav. They would feed it out of a golden cup. It's not kavadik. What are you feeding a cow out of a golden cup for? That's not normal. It says it's not a cow actually. It says the Gemara, Amar Rava Guzma. Nah, it's just a guzma. It's just an exaggeration. Amar Ravami Dibra Torah Lashon Havoy. We see in the Torah that there were exaggerative languages. Dibro, Neviim Lashon Havoy. By the Neviim, it's also true. And Dibru Chachamim B'Lashon Havoy. Torah, Neviim, and Chachamim. All of them have exaggerative languages. Dibru Chachamim Lashon Havoy Hada Amran. That's what we just said. That by the tapuach, by the ash in the middle of the top of the mizbech, there were 300 kor. No, there weren't. It was much less than that. Dibra Torah Lashon Havoy. The Torah also does this because how does it describe cities? When it is being discussed in Dvarim Perik Aleph, says the Gemara, Arm Gedolos V'Tzoros Bashamayim. Cities, they go all the way up to the heavens. His house is so big it reaches the sky. No, it's exaggerative. And Dibur Nevi'im Lashon Havai, how do we know that? Because it says in Navi, and this is a pasuk in Malachim Aleph Perik Aleph. The pasuk says, Vatibakah Aretz Lekola, that the earth opened because of their voices. No, it did not. It was just very loud. And Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani, Amar Shmuel b'shloshim makom v'tibur chachamim lashon havai. There are 3 times that the chachamim utilize the language of exaggeration. Eloheim tapuach, gefen, uparoches. By the tapuach, which we have already seen, tapuach hada amran. By gefen, ditnan. Gefen shel zav haiso mendes al pischo shel heichal. By the heichal and the base of mikdash, tikanu v'tibonim imher v'yamenu. We should be able to bring korbanos soon. So there they had something which was very interesting. They had a cluster of grapes, of golden grapes, that was a medes al pischo, umudle al gabe klunasos, and it was hanging on poles. Anyone who were to give a singular grape or to give a cluster of grapes, maybe v'tolaba, they would be able to come with a little hook. They would add it on. It was probably gorgeous. I'm sure it was very, very expensive. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Reb Tzadok, Ma'aseh. There was a story. V'nimnu alav shalosh me'as kohanim lefanosa. And they tell the story where there were 300 people that had to be involved. Lefanosa, to clean it, to move it. That obviously is a guzma, 300 people. You can't get 300 people to even touch the item at the same time. It's way too many people. Obviously, it was less than that, so it's a guzma. What about the paroches, the third example of where the chachamim were exaggerative? So the paroches was, as we know, some type of special cover in the heichal. Datnan. The Mishnah says as follows. This Mishnah is as well in Maseches Tamid Rebbe. The second of the wide lines. We'll learn 4 more lines, and we're going to stop for the night. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Mishum Reb Shimon Askan. Paroches ovia tefach. The thickness was about 4 inches. The al shivim ushnayim nirim ne'ereges. It was on a 72 heddle loom. They would make these, the way that the thread ran was through 72 heddles, which is a very, very high count. Ve'al kol nima v'nima esrim v'arba'a chutin. Every strand was woven from 24 other strands. Orka arba'im be'ama. The height of it was arba'im be'ama, was 40 amos. V'rechava esrim be'ama was 20 wide. Umishmonim ushte ribo nases. Two different understandings of what this means. When it says that it was made out of 820,000 threads, Rashi, second of the wide lines, umishmona v'shisin ribo chutin, that's 82 times 10,000, or lishnachrina, ribos are na'aros ha'oskos ba, 82 young women who were involved in the crafting of the parochas. Vishtayim osim b'shana, they would make two of these per year. And then here's our exaggeration. Says the Gemara, ushalosh meos mevatlinosa, matbilinosa, ushalosh meos kohanim matbilinosa. It would take 300 kohanim in order to tovel it. So that's exaggerative. Doesn't even make any sense. Way too many people. We're going to stop right here at V'yerach Shal Yamin. We could have learned a few more lines, but it'll be much cleaner for us to start from there tomorrow. And the Mir Hashem will pick up right at these two dots, 12 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Yamud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.